Joseph Stalin, the dark truth behind Stalin's rise to power. What if the most powerful man in a country wasn't the loudest voice, but the quiet one nobody noticed? While revolutionaries gave speeches, wrote manifestos, and chased glory, one man stayed in the background, watching everything. He wasn't the obvious leader, he wasn't the crowd favorite, but by the time anyone realized what he was doing, he controlled an entire nation, and millions of lives hung in the balance. This is the story of how Joseph Stalin didn't just rise to power. He engineered it from the shadows. Before the world knew him as Joseph Stalin, man of steel, he was Yosef Jugashvili, a boy born into poverty in the Georgian town of Gori. His father was a violent alcoholic, his mother a deeply religious woman who hoped he would become a priest. For a time, Stalin studied in a church seminary, but he was expelled after becoming involved with radical political ideas. Unlike many future Soviet leaders, he wasn't known for brilliant theory or inspiring speeches. What he did have was resilience, a long memory for grudges, and a willingness to do the dirty work others avoided. He organized strikes, spread illegal propaganda, and helped plan bank robberies to fund the Bolshevik cause. Arrests and exile became a routine part of his life, but each punishment only hardened him. While others built reputations as thinkers, Stalin built connections with underground networks and learned how power operated at the street level. He studied people closely, who was loyal, who was weak, who could be useful. Long before he held official authority, Stalin was already practicing the quiet skills of control, manipulation, and survival that would later define his rule. The Russian Revolution of 1917 shattered the old empire and brought the Bolsheviks to power under Vladimir Lenin. History tends to focus on dramatic speeches and bold leaders during this period, but revolutions are not run on passion alone. They run on paperwork, organization, and communication. That's where Stalin found his opportunity. Rather than compete with famous figures like Leon Trotsky in public debates, he took on practical administrative roles inside the new government. He worked on internal party affairs, managed nationalities policy, and handled organizational details that others considered dull. These roles gave him something far more valuable than applause: access. He saw how decisions were made, how orders moved through the system, and where influence truly lived. He also learned which officials were ambitious, which were insecure, and which could be pressured. While the revolution stars argued about the future of socialism, Stalin embedded himself deep inside the party's structure. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave him a map of the entire political machine. And once you understand the machine, you can learn how to control it, piece by piece. In 1922, Stalin was appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party. At the time, the position sounded bureaucratic and unimportant, more about files than power, but the role gave him authority over party appointments, and in a one-party state, the party was the gateway to every position of influence in the country. Stalin now had a say in who got promoted, who was transferred, and who faded into obscurity. He began placing loyal supporters in key roles across the government, military, and regional leadership. These weren't necessarily the most talented people, but they were grateful and dependent on him. Over time, a quiet network of personal loyalty spread throughout the Soviet system. Local officials owed their careers to Stalin. Rising politicians knew their futures depended on staying in his good graces. Meanwhile, many senior leaders underestimated the significance of what he was building. They saw a paperwork manager. They didn't see a man constructing a political army. By the time they realized that Stalin's influence reached into every corner of the party, challenging him no longer meant facing one rival. It meant confronting an entire structure designed to protect him. When Lenin's health declined and he died in 1924, the the Soviet Union faced a massive leadership crisis. No clear successor had been named, and several powerful figures believed they were the rightful heir. Leon Trotsky seemed like the natural choice. He was a brilliant speaker, a key leader of the revolution, and the creator of the Red Army. But Stalin understood something Trotsky did not. Popularity meant little without institutional support. Stalin formed temporary alliances with other leaders who also feared Trotsky's influence. Together, they portrayed Trotsky as arrogant, unreliable, and ideologically extreme. Using his control over party procedures, Stalin limited Trotsky's authority, blocked his appointments, and gradually isolated him from decision-making. Party members who owed their positions to Stalin voted against Trotsky again and again. The process was slow, bureaucratic, and devastatingly effective. Trotsky was first sidelined, then removed from leadership, then expelled from the Communist Party altogether. Eventually, he was forced into exile, where he remained a distant threat, one Stalin would later eliminate permanently. The most formidable rival to Stalin's power didn't fall in a dramatic showdown, but through careful, methodical political suffocation. With Trotsky gone, Stalin no longer needed the alliances that helped him defeat him. One by one, he turned on his former partners. Leaders who had stood beside him were suddenly accused of disloyalty, sabotage, or secret plots against the state. These accusations led to a series of staged public trials where prominent Bolsheviks confessed to impossible crimes. The confessions were extracted through threats, torture, or promises to spare family members. The outcomes were predetermined, guilty verdicts followed by execution or imprisonment. These events, known as the show trials, shocked the nation. Old revolutionaries who had once been celebrated as heroes were now labeled traitors. By destroying figures who had helped build the Soviet Union, Stalin sent a terrifying message. Past loyalty meant nothing. No one was untouchable. Political survival now depended entirely on obedience to him. The revolution was no longer a collective leadership. It was becoming a system centered on one man, where trust disappeared and fear took its place. By the late 1930s, Stalin expanded his campaign from political elites to society as a whole in what became known as the Great Purge. Secret police arrested military officers, government officials, factory managers, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens. Some were executed quickly. Millions more were sent to brutal forced labor camps known as gulags. Entire communities lived in fear of a knock at the door in the middle of the night. Accusations could come from co-workers, neighbors, even friends trying to protect themselves. The charges were often vague, anti-Soviet behavior or suspicious activity, but the consequences were severe. The purges devastated the Soviet military and administration, yet Stalin saw them as necessary. Terror was no longer just a method to remove enemies. It became a tool to prevent opposition from ever forming. When people are afraid to speak, organize, or even think critically, resistance dies before it begins. Stalin had transformed fear into a permanent foundation of his rule. As repression tightened, Stalin worked to control not just people, but truth itself. Propaganda portrayed him as a wise, almost fatherly figure guiding the nation toward a bright future. Photographs were altered to erase purged officials from history. Textbooks were rewritten to exaggerate Stalin's role in the revolution and minimize or erase the contributions of his rivals. Former heroes became villains overnight. Children grew up learning songs and stories praising Stalin, while newspapers credited him for every success in industry, agriculture, and defense. By reshaping the past and controlling information in the present, Stalin made his leadership appear natural and unquestionable. To many Soviet citizens, especially younger generations, There seemed to be no alternative version of history. The man who had once operated quietly in the background now stood at the center of a carefully constructed reality where his authority felt absolute and inevitable. Stalin's rise to power wasn't a single coup or dramatic takeover. It was a slow, calculated climb built on patience, manipulation, and fear. By the time the world saw the dictator clearly, he had already reshaped a nation and the lives of millions in his image. And it all began not with a roar, but with a whisper in the shadows.